Welcome back to the When I Heard This podcast. My name is Nate Robinsoff, and I'm with Joseph Tillman. How are you, Joseph?
Absolutely grand, my man.
This is the second part of the Church Hurt episode, and we will be getting started with that right now. Okay, so personally, what have you seen?
So what type of church hurt have I personally seen?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, every one of the ones I listed above, I've seen.
Okay.
I've seen them, or I've experienced them, or I've had family experience every one of them.
Okay. So as a pastor, you see and hear all the things.
Yeah, I see and I've experienced. So it's not just secondhand knowledge, it's firsthand experience as well.
Is there anything close to what we're talking about in the Bible?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously the phrase church hurt's not used, right? But there is an example of church hurt that comes from leadership in Scripture. And it's actually with Peter, who is one of, he's referred to as a pillar of the faith and one of the leaders of the early church. And so in Galatians chapter 2, Paul actually confronts Peter. And what's happened is, so God had revealed to Peter that salvation through Christ was not just for Jews alone, but for everyone. And this was a big deal because Jews did not eat at the same table with a non-Jew. The disciples of Jesus were even appalled that he was having a conversation with a woman in Samaria. One, because she was a woman, and that just culturally was not acceptable, but two, because she was a Samaritan and not a Jew, and were considered less than. And so God had revealed that his salvation was for everyone. Therefore, all now were invited, if you were, to the table. And so no one was to be excluded. And so for a while, it seemed like this was the case. It was functioning this way. But in Galatians chapter 2, what we see is that Paul is now confronting Peter because Peter has now shifted gears, if you were, and has kind of reverted back to his old Jewish ways and now excluding the non-Jews from the table. And so I'm trying to try to picture you're a non-Jew, you've come to know Christ, you've been accepted in, and the whole church welcomes you. Okay, Jews, Gentile alike, they're all welcomed. And now all of a sudden you're being told, you're not quite good enough to eat with us anymore.
Okay.
And so almost like you're second class is how it would have come across. And so Peter had reverted back to this. Paul confronts Peter, and Peter repents from it. And so I think that's one example of where we see this idea of quote unquote church hurt, of being, I can be hurt, I can be offended, I can feel rejected. That would have been having a pretty big, Peter was he's like the man, right? And all of a sudden now he's rejecting you.
He's the one that has the book that lets us in. Right?
Right. Yeah, he's up there at the pearly gates.
Wow, he doesn't have a good resume for this.
Who is this guy going to actually let in?
Right.
And so, that's one example. There's another example in the book of James where James is writing to the churches, and he's saying, "Do not show favoritism to those who are wealthy, and simply leave the poor to the back rows, if you were." And so you're already dealing, even in the early church, there's the leaders of the church are having to work through this. And anytime we feel rejected because of ethnicity or social status, or we just don't quote unquote fit in the with the group, right, and you feel rejected by the leaders, that can lead to church hurt. So those are a couple of things that you can find in Scripture.
That was very cool to hear.
Okay.
I did not know that story. because Gentiles, right?
Mm-hmm.
They did nothing. They didn't even do anything wrong.
No, nothing
They
wrong.
just were.
Yeah.
And there was I guess now arbitrary point of separation between this group of people and this other group of people, and for some reason they were out.
Correct.
And that lines up pretty well. I mean, like,
Yeah.
that cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those that have, experienced church hurt, especially like via racism,
Right.
I mean, that's exactly what this is talking about here. When I've heard it say before that, there's not racism addressed in Scripture, that's actually not true. You find it here with the Jews and the Gentiles, and that's probably a whole other podcast in and of itself too.
Right.
But the reality is that there's already that. So many of the letters are dealing with the relationship between the Jews and the Gentiles. And so you're already dealing with that aspect of church hurt from point one.
Why does the church allow this to happen? And I guess, does it know it's happening? Like, this is a new term, I guess. Like, has anything been addressed about this? Does anybody even know to address this? Are we going to address this in 30 years from now, which is how the church does everything?
Right.
Like,
no, I think there's always been church hurt without using that phrase.
okay.
So, I think the use of social media has allowed that phrase to become really popular, but also not just popular, but it's allowed people to express your voice. And also you realize now, because of social media, holy cow, there's a lot of people that have been hurt by church.
Right.
And so it's not just like this one random person that gets mad and leaves the church. There's actually legitimate reasons people stop going to church. And it's not just because they're quote unquote backslidden or that they have chosen another way. Sometimes it's because the church really has legitimately hurt them. And there just wasn't a voice or a platform for there to be a voice for it before, where now there can be. But no, I would hope that most churches are aware that this is going on. I do think you'll find some churches that just kind of have their heads in the sand, and it's almost like, well, if you just don't get on board with every point with us, that's not on us, that's on you. Or if you leave, well, that's just on you, not us. I do think there's probably some of those churches that are out there, but I do think most churches are probably in touch with the fact that individuals leave church at times because they're hurt, or they stay. I mean, church hurt doesn't necessarily mean you leave the church, right? You can stay within church being hurt by that church. Or you can maybe leave one church and go to another church because you've been hurt. And so, no, I do believe there's an awareness. And I do think the awareness has only grown because of social media, the use of this phrase, individuals speaking out about it. I do think there's probably a larger awareness of it. Why does the church allow it to happen, though, if they're so aware of it? Church hurt happens because people are involved. And I'm not excusing it, but I'm just trying to be honest about it.
Right.
Where there are people, especially people that we see often, that we're invested in doing life with, we will experience hurt. And so this is true in families, our jobs, church, other social groups that we're a part of. I don't know if the church is sitting there going, we're just going to allow church hurt to happen. I do think that when people are involved, that there's going to be these types of defenses. I will say, on a leadership perspective, sometimes church hurt is just allowed to happen. In other words, if you've got a senior leader that is just on an ego trip or power trip or whatever, and he's belittling people, demeaning people, he's not held accountable to anybody. Someone in that church has got to stand up and say, this is not okay. I know that in some circles, there's this phrase like, don't put a hand to the man of God. Don't touch God's anointed. That's just, I mean, anyway, I could go off a tangent on how bad the exegesis of that language is from the because it comes from an interaction with David and Saul, King Saul. And so, I could go into that. But the point just being is that church leaders need to be held accountable. Like we all have to, as a pastor, I've got to be able to answer to somebody. Someone has to be able to be in my ear to say, Joseph, you didn't handle this correctly, or we're seeing this pattern in you, and we're concerned, and we need to address it. If I only surround myself with yes men, I'm a lost cause in that sense. And so I do think there has to be accountability in church, and maybe that's sometimes where the institution of the church fails us, is when there's not that accountability, that structure that is not like, we need structure to not just allow a single leader or leaders plural just to kind of run wild, if you were, without any type of accountability.
Have you done it?
Have I done what?
Have you hurt people in your church?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Unintentionally, yes. And even I know that it gets dicey when you say intentionally, unintentionally. I'll say it both ways. I've unintentionally, unknowingly hurt people. So I've disappointed them. I didn't meet some expectation they had of me. I didn't show up to an event that was really important to someone that I didn't know was important to them. Or maybe I said I was going to come, I didn't come, right? There's two times that come to my mind in particular, okay? When I think about church hurt and how I have hurt others, there's two specific times that come to my mind. One, I was doing some biblical counseling with someone. They were seeking advice. I pretty much gave them an ultimatum. And so, in other words, I was seeing a dysfunction in a dating relationship. I'll put it that way. And I was like, you need to end that. I was giving an ultimatum. That to me is overstepping my bounds as a pastor and a leader, right? Like that I should be able, because I have to treat people as autonomous individuals, that they have their own ability to make decisions, and that boundaries exist where I can't come in and control someone else's life and decisions.
So that was the boundary that
I crossed, because I was going over and basically I was saying, I'm eliminating choice from the equation, and I am dictating to you in this relationship. And so the person did, but then it devastated them simultaneously because they did it to please me, and I would never do that again. And I've talked to this person about it. So it's something that we have talked about, and we're reconciled, and we're good. But it's one of those things, I way overstepped my bounds. And I should have never, so as an early 30-something-year-old pastor, I was trying to be protective of this individual, and I went too far with it. It's like as a parent, for example, I can give advice and counsel to my kids, right? And there's some level of the way I parent morphs and changes as my kids get older. Like there's going to be at times where you dictate to your kids early on because their own ability to get hurt is at stake, right? Don't run into the road,
right?
Don't touch the stove when it's hot, okay? And so, but as my of a teenager, I have to allow my teenager to make some decisions now, and I can give counsel, and I can give direction, and I can even tell them, my counsel to you is don't do this. But when I step over that line and go, I demand it of you, when they're at an age where they can choose for themselves, no, I've violated that line. And so that's one part, because that is for me an abuse of leadership, And then there's another time where I was in a setting where another leader was just letting someone have it. I just sat quietly there. and it really in deference to the older leader.
Mm.
And instead of speaking up and saying we can't talk to individuals this way, I sat there quietly.
So they were mad at you for not standing up for them.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And they should have been.
Mm-hmm.
And again, same thing. I have talked to this person. Like, we've walked through this thing together, and because they felt so hurt by my silence. And so, yes, there's been a couple of those instances, and that's, and I'm not saying there's the only two. I'm not saying that. I'm just using those as two examples where I know that I have hurt others. And that's when you're a leader, that is so painful because you don't know what are going to be the long lasting effects, of your choices and your decisions. And, I hope that I grow, and I hope that I wouldn't make the same mistakes at 43 that I did at 33. But the reality is, I know I'll probably look back. I'll be 53 looking back at 43-year-old Joseph and going, why in the world did you do that? And so I know that's a reality, and I know I'm going to hurt people, whether, and many times I think it's unintentionally, but I just know that I will, based upon, one, people's expectations, but then two, I'm also probably going to hurt people with what I say. If I'm speaking as much as I speak on a week-to-week basis,
right,
on a Sunday morning and on a Wednesday night, throw in a podcast, the reality is I'm going to more than likely hurt someone as well. And even though I don't necessarily mean to.
So, okay, that brings me to another question. What is it? The only reason I came back to church a few years ago, only to leave again, to then I've come to church the past 2 Sundays.
You sure have.
Thank you.
You sure have. I'm giving you props for that, bro.
So, the only reason I came back to church the few years ago, the only way I could wrap my head around it was me going, these people are going to act and treat each other and treat me no differently than anybody else out there. That was the only justification in my head I could come to why it got me back in the door. So that's where I was then. I held church people and leaders to the same standard, and maybe in fact less of a standard than everybody else.
Wow.
And so for me and anybody else, what is my part in this? Like, when you did that to that other person, where should they be at? How should they think about it? Okay, so in other words, how does the individuals on the other end of the 2 examples that you just gave prepare themselves for potential situations like this to happen with their leadership or with somebody else in the church?
Yeah, because you do want to believe that your leaders have your best interest at heart. You do want to believe that you can trust your leaders to protect you and to, again, always do what is best for you. So I think in many ways, it's similar to the way a lot of us feel about our parents. We want to believe they have our best interest at heart, and we want to believe they're going to protect us, and always say the right thing. And the reality is they're not. Even the best of parents are not always going to say and do the right thing.
But then you grow up and realize they're just people.
Right, you grow up and realize they're just people. For leaders, so for example, the 2 examples I gave, so both those individuals that I mentioned, I was very close with. So they expected me to have their best interest at hand. And when I crossed a boundary line in my counsel with one, and when I was just silent with the other, it hurt them a lot because of the relationship we had. And I'll just be honest, talking with one of them, one of them was like, by the grace of God, was willing to have a conversation with me, was willing to talk with me, and I with them. But their first gut reaction was, forget them all, I'm out. That was their first gut reaction. And like, I completely get why that was their gut reaction. You know, they've got one leader yelling at them and another one being silent. Like, I get that. For the other one, they were just so hurt, devastated, because they probably viewed me more like a fatherly figure, and so their hurt was pretty intense. But again, in reaching out to them and talking with them, like walking through the hurt, walking through the pain. But I do think, for one example, the individual was like in their 20s, the one I was counseling in their 20s. So like, for the one example, I think that was like a wake-up call to, oh crap, church leadership can suck sometimes. Like you were talking about earlier, like with the reaction of your kids, you kind of pull the curtain back and you see, man, our leaders are not perfect. They're not always the best. And so that was that individual's reaction. And it has still left a mark. And then on the other side, the individual was older. So the individual had the processing capability and the life experience to go, okay, they hurt me. That was terrible. I really just want to leave and get out of here. But I've got long-standing relationships with them. I'm not going to allow that one moment to be the defining mark of my relationship with them. And surely we can reconcile and work some things out. And that's exactly what happened. And so I think for one who is older, they were able to process it in a way that their life experiences and just their age allowed them to process it. For the younger one in her 20s, that was like kind of almost, again, their wake-up call. Wow, church leadership can suck sometimes. And maybe church is not as great as I thought it was. When you ask how you prepare or have expectations, I think the expectation that they had was going in was right. In the sense of, we're going to trust Joseph to care for us and to walk us through this. But at the same time, that should be their expectation. And at the same time, when their expectation was not met, like when I didn't meet their expectation, I think that's where not just knowing people and not just knowing church, but like, I guess it is some of it just knowing how to handle church. Knowing how to handle church leadership and knowing that when they hurt me, what do I do? Right. I think the older one was like, okay, I've been hurt before. I can work through this. The other one had never experienced it before. And so for this individual, it was, what in the crap do I do now? And so I think that it left the individuals kind of having to process and grapple with it differently. But I'm just thankful that I was able to have conversations with both, and usually multiple conversations with them to walk out this thing where we actually are reconciled. I am actually reconciled with both of these parties, and I think a big part of it is me acknowledging my error in it. And that I can't just sit there and go, well, you know what? Too bad. Suck it up. Sorry. Or even just, sorry I blew it. But, right. And just blowing it off. But no, I owned it and I realized the hurt that it instilled.
We got other members.
Yeah.
It'll be fine.
Exactly. No, I can't do that. Like, right. Own it, ask for forgiveness, and know that I've got to build their trust back up over time. So.
How should the church be managing people's expectations of itself in this area? Like, I grew up in church and eventually ended up thinking of it as the people there and the institution know better than anything else. How do we, assuming I'm not alone,
right?
Which I feel like I'm not. How does the church manage the expectations of people growing up in it, or of new members of the church? Because I feel like, honestly, that this is sort of the same thing for people who are brand new Christians at 35 or whatever.
Yeah.
And have gone through all of the things and finally find this group of people, the Christians that are You know, like, I thought you guys were horrible, but, you know, you're not that bad. And then, oh, wait, you are. You are that, you know, I ended up in a bad one. Oh, you are that bad. Now I'm off to the next thing to maybe make me feel happy. Like, how does the church manage expectations instead of coming across the way they do?
Man, that's a good question. I think I mentioned this earlier, and I'll refer back to it, but just that leadership has to create a space in their talking of who the church is and our expectations. And I guess I'm sitting here and I'm thinking on a couple of different levels. One is that I know that people in the church as a whole just don't all suck. Right? Like, not everyone is hurting somebody.
Right.
Not everyone is offending someone. Like, there are people that are genuinely loving and caring. And somehow we have to be able to say, I guess I mean a few things. One, I think we can say that expectation is people are going to fail you. People are going to disappoint you. That will happen here. You know, I was thankful to be in a church where there was a senior pastor that he did acknowledge that from the pulpit. Like, you're going to be hurt here. You're going to be disappointed. Hopefully not because of anything we intentionally do, but you will be hurt and disappointed because you're going to be interacting with us a whole lot. And at some level, at some point, you may feel hurt, betrayed, not accepted, you know, those types of things. And that will happen here. So that's one. Two, we don't want to reduce individuals down to their worst moment or their biggest struggle, especially if they're fighting through it and trying to quote unquote, live better, be better. But I think that helps if we acknowledge from the pulpit that we are in process. So you can expect to be hurt, but know that there are people that may hurt you are not trying always to hurt you, and that will happen. And then three, there are people here that are loving and caring over the long haul with you, with people, and that are accepting, even if they disappoint or they cause you to be offended, whatever it may be. Every once in a while, I hope you look at the total view and scope of your interactions with them, relationship with them, life with them, and go, okay, but that's not who they are. Now, at the same time, I think talking about expectations, man, the expectations is sometimes there are people that, I don't know how to phrase this any better. Sometimes there's people that in the churches that are just jerks, or just that are not acting in a Christ-like behavior or way, or maybe that are not even Christian at all. And, there is that conversation of kind of wolves in sheep clothing, And so I don't want to, here's what my concern is. When I say things like, let's don't relegate someone down to their worst moment or their worst behavior, I also don't want to minimize it, one, but then two, there could be individuals that are actually, sexual predators that are there. That is who they are. They are their worst behavior. And so I'm careful when I say things I want to be careful when I say things like that. But I do think the expectation is, hey, we're going to talk about it. We're going to be honest about it. And we're going to try not to set everyone up on a pedestal. One of the things that I even warn our congregation against is don't set up people on pedestals that you don't know very well.
Right.
Because they're more than likely going to disappoint you at some point. I actually had a campus pastor when I was in college, and he said he would tell all of us, just read books by the dead people. They won't disappoint you. And I love that phrase because it's that reality that whether, back then it was reading books, but, the podcast we're listening to, that includes us, I guess, the podcast we're listening to, or the YouTube channel we follow, whatever it may be, We don't want to put those people up on pedestals. We don't know those people more than likely. If you don't know someone, don't put them up on a pedestal.
Mm.
And I'm always very, especially like with our teenagers and young believers, I try to be mindful with them, mindful to tell them, be careful. Just be careful not to idolize someone so much, so high when you don't really know them.
Mm.
Hopefully they will not, crash and burn. But if they do, you won't be like a house of cards that comes crashing down with it because you had placed all your hopes or dreams on that individual. I hope that speaks to the question you asked.
It does. I have a follow-up question, I guess. Do you think if I put all of the churches in America in a jar and picked out 100,
okay,
would I find people that acted better in those 100 churches than in the rest of the world in America, or the rest of regular American life today?
I think so.
Okay.
I didn't say it with a lot of confidence,
Yeah,
did I?
no, you didn't.
And here's what I was, Wes. I paused because here's what I was thinking in my head. How are we judging that by better? Like what moral standards are we setting to that?
Well, right, but the biblical moral standards.
Yeah, I do think that I do think you will find people in the church that hold to all right. So, for example, forgiveness is not a high value for people that are outside of the church. A lot of times, in other words, why would I forgive you? In other words, like if you've hurt me, forget you.
Right.
Done with you. I write you off. I think you'll find people in churches that are more willing to forgive.
Okay.
Because they've been forgiven themselves. And so I do think you will find individuals in churches that will be more gentle and more kind with their words. I'm not saying across the board in every church, every person's this way, right? But I think that, yes. But then I also acknowledge simultaneously that there are good moral people that are outside of the Christian faith, that there are people who simply choose to live quote unquote moral good lives. But I would hope things like forgiveness, hope things like having peace and joy in really crappy circumstances would be found amongst believers. But do I think that there are morally good individuals that are living up to a moral standard, if you were, of even biblical Christianity? Yeah, I do think you can find people that are just going to do good because that's their moral compass and that's what they do.
So if I take my "this is why I'm leaving church" lifetime argument,
right, your stack of arguments,
my stack of arguments, and stack that against attending a church today at given random church, you think that me attending church at given random church is better than me not going, even though I have this list of reasons why I think that's a terrible idea, and there's tons of other people with their list of reasons why it's a terrible idea. You still think it's better to come?
I do.
Okay.
I do. And to be honest with you,
and I will be treated better generally by people at church than I'm going to find anywhere else, even though I have this list of reasons why church has hurt me.
I think that church is still good and still necessary for the believer, even in light of the stack of arguments.
Okay.
And I say that not as a pastor, because I know that's very pastorish for me to say. I'm saying that as someone who's intimately experienced church hurt.
Okay.
And have fought through, do we want to go to church still? And landing on yes. And this is why.
Okay, this is a question for me. I'm 4 years old, growing up in church. What should I think about people at church? What should I expect from people? What should I think about people? Should I know about the leaders doing anything wrong?
At 4?
At 4.
Okay. So and I promise you, I'm not trying to just pass the buck.
Right.
Okay. I think parents have a responsibility to inform their children on what they feel is appropriate, age-wise. And so if at 4 years old, I would hope that your expectation of church is that church is safe. That's what I would hope. Church is safe.
So at 10 years old, what should I know about everybody? What should I think about everybody?
That's a good question. So I have children close to that age, and I want our children. So this, to me, this so starts with parenting, and I can't stress that enough. In parenting, I want my children to be aware that their parents fail, and and we ask for forgiveness. Now, in my household, it's a little interesting because not only are we parents who go to church, I'm also pastor. But I want them to know that they don't think of me as pastor. They think of me as dad. But I want them to know their dad, who happens to be their pastor, will own his mistakes, own his failures, and not hide them. When I've hurt them, when I can tell that I've disappointed them, and then I can say, guys, I'm sorry that your dad hurt you. And I think in the same way that I would still want parents to be able to, inform their kids to whatever specific degree, right? To get into the specifics. But in general, at 10 years old, you need to know that people are not perfect. And that includes people in the church. And the church leadership is not perfect.
And at 10 years old, I should be aware of this.
I think so.
Thinking about this.
I think so.
I know I definitely was not.
Yeah. I can only speak for what we do with our kids.
Yeah.
Like our kids, if you were to ask our kids.
This is how you're doing it.
Yeah. If you were to ask our kids, do leaders in church make mistakes? They're going to quickly say yes. And maybe that's because they live with one of them. I don't know, But that is what we want them to know, that church leaders are not perfect either. We want them to respect the church leaders that are worthy of respect, but we also let them know that they're not perfect. They're children's ministry leaders, they're youth leaders. They're not perfect. They're trying to follow Jesus, the best way they know how to, and that's what we express to our kids.
If I had that anywhere in my brain back then, or was told it or taught it without having to figure it out, it really would have helped. I think, and would have made a difference for me.
Gotcha.
Because as far as I knew, I was the only one doing anything wrong. When I got older.
Right. So, in other words, your perspective of church then in a lot of ways was, this is where I go to get told I'm doing things wrong.
Right.
Wow.
And to feel guilty about it.
Right. Wow. That's a tough place to be. That's a tough psychological place to be for a kid, for a teenager, for an adult even. I think we have to lay proper expectations for our kids. And then if your child's in middle school or high school, and there's a leader that falls morally, and that leader's no longer there because of it, tell your kid what happened. Don't hide that from the child. Tell them, you don't have to get into all the details, but hey, the pastor had an affair, or the pastor stole money, or we found out the pastor was an alcoholic, or whatever it may be. I think at that age,
if you see him again and he offers you a ride, don't get in the car.
Bingo. But I think at that age, middle school, high school, they're old enough to hear the truth.
Yeah. Okay.
And then it helps them have proper expectations. And like what you talked about earlier, they're not wondering, why is this person just no longer here?
Right.
They know why that person's no longer there. And then we as parents, because we're still parenting them at that point, their ages, we have the opportunity to help them walk through that and process it. I think that's a huge deal. And I think oftentimes kids, this may go back to what you were talking about earlier, kids are not just sheltered from the world, they're sheltered from processing hurt, pain, struggle.
Right.
When they really, as parents, that is the great, no, I don't want any person to have to go through, church hurt or church leadership moral failures or those kind of things. But if they do, here's how we process that. We can walk our kids through that and like teach them how to in a healthy manner engage with their hurt, with their pain, and how to process that and still love Jesus and his church. I think that's an opportunity that we have as parents to be able to do that with our kids.
So another future topic is raising your children.
Yeah.
It's just going to be a really long one also.
Yeah, raising our children, in particular, raising our children in church.
In church.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yikes.
So, all right. So we're going to do this again. I am a church goer.
Mm-hmm.
I should expect people at church
Mm-hmm.
to behave better than people I see out there.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm not a church goer, I should also expect people at church as a whole to be better than people who don't go to church as a whole.
Yes.
And I'm making the distinction church going and not church going.
Okay.
That's a fair statement.
Sure.
I should also hold the leaders to a higher standard than either of them.
Correct.
And especially a higher standard than people who do not attend church.
Correct.
And that's leaders all the way up to the top.
Correct.
Okay. I should also expect / be conscious and mindful that people at church are going to hurt me, even though I am supposed to also simultaneously hold them to a higher standard.
Yes.
Is that a good way to put that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And so when things happen, I should feel hurt by them
Mm-hmm.
because I held them to a higher standard.
Mm-hmm.
But I also should have known that something like this could happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I should have known that something like this could happen when I was 12 years old,
Mm-hmm.
10 to 12 years old.
Yes.
So at that point, I should be aware that I'm entering this world of knowledge about more things and more experience in life, and people are going to hurt me, even though I should stick with these people. These people are going to hurt me less than people out there who are not going to church on average.
On average. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I won't say, because there's going to be times there
Yes.
will be people who will hurt you more.
Right.
So.
There are going to be times that people will hurt me more, but as a whole, this is a better path for my existence.
Yes.
Sticking with these church-going people.
Yes.
And you still believe that in America today, given our random sample of churches.
Yes.
Okay.
I do.
So, also, if I am a person who is unhappy with everything else that's going on out there in the world, who is not a Christian or churchgoer, and I start going to church / am a Christian now, I should expect to probably be hurt pretty quickly because it's bound to happen somehow.
Yeah, I don't know if it'll necessarily happen quickly.
Okay.
But I do think it'll happen at some point. The reality is the closer we get with people in relationship,
Right.
the more prone we are to be hurt by them. And so, and we're always, when we use the word hurt, we're also being mindful of the degrees of hurt.
Right.
And so I hope you don't run into hurt quickly.
Right.
But do I believe that you will be hurt? Yes, it's because we become invested into relationships. And anytime we are invested into relationships, we will become hurt at some level.
Okay. If the hurt at a particular church or from a particular group of Christians becomes too much for me personally to handle.
Mm-hmm.
Finding another group of Christians in another church is still a better option than anything else. Than finding than not going to church and trying to interact with people who do not attend church.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, we don't want to project onto every other church that they're going to hurt us in the same ways that maybe the present church we're at is. And I do, as a leader, I would hope that you've come forward, talked to the leadership about it. Hey, I'm experiencing, I'm hurt, I'm disappointed, I'm offended, I feel betrayed, I feel rejected, I feel whatever. I'm coming to the leadership, I'm expressing this, and if there's nothing done about it,
right.
At that point, yeah.
Or they say, we don't care.
Correct. Or they say, yeah, get over it, or whatever it may be. Yeah, okay.
Or that's just them.
Right. And then but I would hope that would be the first step that's taken, is you go to the leadership, and you say, this is what's happening. And then if nothing's ever done about it, nothing's ever changed, or they just don't seem to care, then you may need to go find another local body.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Which is still better than going and hanging out with non-Christians who are going to hurt me worse, who I should expect less of.
Yeah. Okay.
Non-churchgoers.
All right. But I want to be clear on this one right here, just the way you phrase that.
Mm-hmm.
I am not saying we cannot go hang out with our friends who are not believers.
Right.
Or who don't go to church.
I just expect less from them when I do.
I think that's a fair assessment.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a fair assessment. In other words, why should I expect someone to hold to a
Value
standard
system
of morality or values that are in the Bible if they don't adhere to Christianity?
Right.
So, sure, I would not expect them to adhere to those values and morals. Whereas I would expect people who are followers of Christ to adhere to the values and morals that are being passed down to us through Scripture. Yeah, that's fair.
Okay. So you think that that's a pretty good summation of what we're talking about?
Absolutely.
Of this whole episode.
Yeah.
Of both of our perspectives, and that's a good way for average church-going Joe / not church-going Joe to think about this topic.
Yep.
Okay. Cool. So we figured it out.
We solved the problem.
Yeah, it's all over.
It's all over.
Thank God.
Next.
All right. That was the When I Heard This Podcast episode, whatever. Thank you, Joseph, for figuring this one out with me, because apparently I had a lot more to say than I thought I was going to. And it probably goes on and doesn't make much sense, but there it is.
Well, we had fun with it, if nothing else.
Yeah, we did.
Good conversation, too. Good conversation.
I think it was really helpful for me to actually talk this out and get to a place where I can think about it in a way that like makes step-by-step sense for how the church actually goes about trying to make this not happen as often as it does.
Sure.
Because the ultimate problem is people leaving because of this.
Right.
And thinking something else is better.
Right. And preparing people for when they do experience church hurt.
Right.
And so their first reaction is not to just get out.
Right.
Yeah.
That has been the When I Heard This Podcast. We are on Facebook and Instagram, and you can find the podcast on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, YouTube, and Rumble. And Joseph, we are on Instagram and Facebook as a podcast, but you are also on Instagram now because you have made an Instagram. And what is your Instagram?
Rev_Joe_T.
I really liked it when I saw it.
Yeah.
Rev Joe T.
Rev Joe T.
Pretty good. And I am Nate Robinsoff, and you can find us individually if you care. But definitely go like the pages on Facebook and Instagram for the podcast, and go find us on all the things. And we will see you next time. Thank you.
Bye.